Hello and welcome to the Nakul Daemosh build video. This is a really popular ship in PvP. You see them all the time and it's stayed relevant for also a long time. I actually got one of these back when it came out in 2016 and I used to run a feedback pulse build on it. So that probably dates me a little bit, but it was a really awesome ship even back then, and it's still really good now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what has kept it relevant all this time, why you see so many of them, and go through a couple of ideas for builds. And a little bit different from my usual build videos is instead of presenting one kind of build and then maybe giving you a couple of options, I'm actually just going to give you kind of a ton of information, and I'm sorry about that, but it's hard to talk about this ship without talking about a bunch of universal consoles and then like control and drain skills and how to hold enemies and that kind of thing. And basically I'm going to try to get into all that stuff and give you sort of the tools that you need to then build an effective Daemosh build. And the way that you actually build that will depend on your play style and who's on your team, or maybe there's, I'll say something and it'll spark an idea that you have in your head about something to try. That's kind of the gist of this build. And if you're coming from a dogfighter, like if you use a Jem'Hadar Escort or a Daemosh or a Warbird or something like that, this play style is going to be really different for you. Because on those ships, you have this constantly rolling healing with the colony consoles. But usually these kind of science builds, and I posted one a long time ago in the Legendary Voyager, they're a bit on the fragile side, and you use something like plot armor for your main heal, which buys you about 15 seconds. But then plot armor is on cooldown for 30 seconds, so you have to do something during that time to stay alive, otherwise you're just going to get blasted. And how you cover that 30-second window of time is kind of up to you. It might be Intel Team and Exodus, or it might be Evade Target Lock, or it might be a universal console that keeps you alive for that time. And I'll go through all of that. But first, let's talk about the ship itself on the wiki here. So first of all, it's a lobby ship, which means that it's expensive because it's still a premium ship, but it's not so crazy expensive that it's completely unobtainable. I think they're hovering on the exchange around like 290 million right now at the time of posting, although I notice whenever I post a video the prices seem to go up. But if you're fast, maybe you could get one cheap. There was just a lobby sale that just ended, so the market's kind of flooded with them. And it does have a major disadvantage in that the hull modifier is only 0.9. So like on this one that I'm in here, my hull is only 73,000. That's really low. So I've got to be especially slippery to make up for that low hull capacity, which also means, and people don't think about this a lot because this game doesn't quite use this the same way, but like I play Mech Warrior, and in that game, there's a thing people call sharing armor, which basically means if everybody is showing at the same time, then your enemy doesn't know who to attack, and it helps spread the damage out so that nobody dies. And in a Daemosh like this, if you're really especially slippery and people aren't shooting you, then they're shooting your teammates. Like if I'm on the other team and I'm shooting at you and you go invisible for a few seconds, I'm still going to put out that damage, but I'm going to put it out on one of your teammates instead of you. And maybe that works and maybe it doesn't. But there's times when I'm flying the Daemosh and I look and all my buffs are up and I'm not in danger, and someone is shooting me, and I intentionally let them shoot me because I'm taking the heat off of someone else on my team. But this ship itself kind of lends to that more elusive play style than like a dogfighter where you can tank a lot more damage. You can't tank as much damage in this build. But speaking of being elusive, you have this very high turn rate and impulse modifier. And I think this is still the fastest, most maneuverable science ship in the game, but I'm not completely positive on that. At the time that this ship came out, it was definitely the fastest and most maneuverable one. And that's also why I had the NX Escort refit page open, is This is an actual 5.2 layout escort. It came out a year later, and it's also a turn rate of 16 and impulse of 20. So the Nakul ship is just as fast as an NX escort, just as an example. So it's a really, really fast platform, and it just has a lot going for it there. And then you also have an Intel seat, which is shared with the tactical seat. And something about that, the reason I have the Legendary Kalian open is that ship also is Intel, and it's full spec, right? So you have full Intel seat. You could do Surgical Strikes 3 or whatever commander rank Intel ability you want. But then you're stuck with this Lieutenant Commander tactical seat that you have to fill. You have to put something in those tactical slots that's just tactical abilities. The Daemosh doesn't have that problem, right? You can put Intel abilities in this seat instead, which gives you a lot more flexibility. And then you also have this engineering seat that can be a pilot, Commander Science, which is what you want anyway for a control build, and then you also have a Lieutenant Commander Universal and an Ensign Universal. So there's so many different ways to run this ship because the layout is just so flexible. And then of course other kind of nice value adds is it has a battle cloak, which is useful for, kind of slipping away or, waiting for the fight in Karat and that kind of thing. And it also has the time slip, which is a universal console that can only be used on Nakul ships, but basically it leaves a duplicate of your ship behind, and you are immune to damage as long as that duplicate is still alive, and that lasts 30 seconds. But a smart enemy will just blow it up and then immediately start shooting you again. But sometimes, like in the craziness of combat, there's a lot going on, and a lot of people are losing target and gaining target and not targeting pets because they're busy with other stuff. So you can drop this time slip, and it buys you some time to not take damage. And it's cool that it just comes on the ship. It's not like something else you need to go buy. So that's what's made it relevant all this time. And I actually have, 7 different bridge officer layouts to talk through. But before I get to that, I also want to talk about universal consoles and like actually equipping the ship first. And I went and I grabbed, my build has been through like 100 different iterations, and I have no idea if the build that I'm running on it right now is the best or not. So what I did was I just unequipped everything and I put it in my inventory so you can see it, and I'm going to go through each one real quick and just kind of point out why you would run it. So on the ship itself, I'm going to go through weapons and consoles and stuff differently, but just to touch on the impulse engines, I always run the fortified prevailing impulse engines because they give me that really rapid speed burst, and that's obviously PvP staple. And then my preferred warp core and shield layout is the bolstered warp core and fortified shields. If you've watched any of my other videos, you've seen me run this exact same setup on pretty much every build that I run now. But you might want to run the Discovery shield and core for the hull regen, or you could run the Revolutionary. I don't know if I have that. No, but I have the Temporal set. So you could run like the Temporal 2-piece. The Temporal 2-piece increases the damage of your gravity wells. The Revolutionary 2-piece gives you like a huge crit severity boost with exotic abilities. There's a couple of options there, but if you go with the Revolutionary or Temporal set, keep in mind that you'll be a lot more fragile. This 3-piece competitive set gives you a lot of energy resistance. The Tilly set gives you hull regen, so those are kind of survivability choices. And I guess that kind of leads into the next part. I'm going to talk about the weapons. So I separated everything out in my inventory here. At the top, these top 2 rows or 3 rows are weapons. And some of these weapons are on here because of a set bonus or a survivability reason, not because they're actually dealing damage. But that's going to depend on the rest of your build. So I'm just going to touch on each one just really, really quick from left to right. So the Delphic Torpedo, I love this torpedo and it does a lot of damage, but the main thing is it has this -10 damage resistance rating thing. And under high yield, it's not a 33% chance. It's guaranteed, and it's -10 per torpedo. So like if you do high yield 1, I think it launches 4 torpedoes, so that's negative 40 damage resistance to your target for 10 seconds. So if you get somebody and they're locked down, you've got them in a hold or whatever, and you nail them with this torpedo, it's going to debuff their resistances a lot. So that's a pretty good option. The Tholian torpedo I grabbed off of the Iktomi. This one has a chance to drain weapons and engine power, so it's really, really good on a drain build. And speaking of drain builds, I'm going to skip one over here. The Morphogenic torpedo. Right now, I think I don't have any drain equipment, or I have a couple of drain consoles on, that's all. But negative 67 all power levels, but it's only for 5 seconds, so it's really short. And it does deal a pretty good amount of damage as well, and since it's an energy torpedo, it doesn't get negated by the target's shields quite as much as a traditional kinetic torpedo does. So that's a really fun one, and there's a cool set bonus for that one too that I'm actually not covering in this video, but 30% crit severity, that's the takeaway from that set. The gravimetric torpedo, so this one, it creates a gravimetric rift near where it explodes. And if you look on the tooltip there, it says reveals cloaked ships. The rift is pretty small, it's only 1 kilometer radius, but it does reveal cloaked ships and prevents ships from using their cloaking device. And it also prevents ships from using Intel Team for a few seconds. I'm not sure exactly how long it is, but if somebody flies through it, they can't activate Intel Team or cloak for a couple of seconds afterwards, so that's pretty cool. The neutronic torpedo, I just grabbed this one a day or two ago, but obviously I've used it before on other characters. This one, it hits really, really hard. It also has a 3 kilometer AoE radiation damage hit that drains power levels. And I know that under torpedo spread, the radiation hit and the power system drain is even higher, so it has some potential there. The wide-angle chronoton torpedo, I really like this one myself. It reduces your target's flight speed and turn rate, and the amount of time that it reduces that depends on your control skill. However, the actual reduction in speed and turn rate isn't all that noticeable on its own, but if you combine it with multiple things, like you hit them with the wide-angle chronoton plus tractor beam plus parasitic ice or plus a drain or something like that, then you can really, really slow somebody down and make them an easier target either for yourself or for your teammates to kill. And that's the other thing about a build like this, is if I'm in a 1v1 with a dogfighter with beam overload or something, that dogfighter is probably going to kill me. Because this is a team, this is a ship that's designed to work in a team. It's not really the best like 1v1 ship, if you're into that kind of thing, so also keep that in mind. The Nausicaan torpedo has a 20% chance for a hold for 5 seconds, so that's really good. The Agony torpedo has a chance to disable for 4 seconds. The plasma emission torpedo that creates a little cloud, this one, while they're in the cloud, it reduces their turn rate and speed, but the part where it says disables cloak, I don't know if it's bugged or what, but that doesn't work. So they can still hit Intel Team and they can still cloak while plasma particle emission is on them. So that's a shame, but oh well. Then there's the enhanced biomolecular torpedo. This, I think, deals one of the highest one-hit high-yield torpedoes in the game. So if you're trying to do like a high-yield torp, you know, one-shot build or something, that's a good option. Now going to energy weapons, there's the Pizio Polaron, either the beam array or the cannons or whatever. That is mostly used for the technical overload, so you can have technical overload on this ship if you slot beam overload or surgical strikes on it. So this is a nice way to add a little bit of spike damage to a ship that might not otherwise have that much spike damage. And then the Phaser, Wide Angle, and Dark Matter Quantum, these two are on here because the two-piece set adds this up to 25% crit severity, and that crit severity affects everything on the ship, including Gravity Well, Tychon's Rift, other science abilities, consoles, that kind of thing. The next set is the Zenkethi Lobi ship set. The two of these together add this 15% shield resistance, which is the original reason why I got it. I'm not really sure if they're worth slotting now, but I figure I mention it. It's a pretty fragile ship, and you do have a lot of shield capacity, so you could try to keep your shields up a little bit more, maybe by slotting the set or slotting some other things that add shield hardness. Next one is the inhibiting Polaron, which can come in a turret or an Omni, but basically this is for the when shooting targets slower than you, -10 all damage resistance rating. And obviously this is a really fast ship, and more importantly, if you hold someone and they're, stopped dead, all you have to do is move forward at a quarter impulse or backwards at a quarter impulse, and you get this -10 debuff on them. So that's one. The Ultimate Omni, this is a personal favorite of mine for my personal build. The chance to reduce the target's plasma and kinetic damage resistance rating. It's not a chance if this weapon crits, so it's a guaranteed -15 plasma and kinetic debuff as long as you crit. And because I use Plasma Storm, and both Tychons and Gravity Well are kinetic damage, that just seems to fit well with this kind of build. Another survivability one, the Radiant Anti-Proton Beam Array, or the Torpedo. These, you have this chance for stacking temporary hit points, so just another layer of defense. And then also similar to that is the Omnidirectional Tetryon turret. That debuffs the target you're shooting's crit chance and severity, but not by a really huge amount. That probably was more effective when this weapon was first introduced in the game, but now -5% crit chance is like not that much. And then I have two mines on here. The Nukara web mine. When you drop these, it only drops 2, but if someone does fly into them, it is a hold effect. And the length of that hold effect, you can see on mine right now it's 5.7 seconds, but that can be increased by control. So if you have really, really high control skill and you get someone in the web mines, you could hold them for a pretty long time. I think with a bunch of control, I think I've seen 10 seconds or 11 seconds, something like that, so that's pretty good. And then kind of similar to that, the Tractor Beam Mine Launcher. That one drops 3 Tractor Beam Mines, and basically if someone flies within 2.5 kilometers of them, they will use a Tractor Beam on that target, and it slows them down a lot. So that's a pretty good one also. I'm not sure if the Tractor Beams from those scale with your control skill or not. I did try, this is an upgradable item, but I tried upgrading one before, and I don't think I noticed any difference in how much hold it had or anything like that, so it's probably not worth upgrading. So moving on to the Deflectors. And before I talk about those, let me mention, I guess, the basic setup. So you've got, I left a couple of trait slots empty, and I'm going to talk about Starship traits specifically. You have Plot Armor, which is the kind of the main heal of this, right? So right now, it heals 69,000 hull over that 15 seconds, and also provides 250 damage resistance, which is really good, and clears all hazards and damage over time effects. So this trait is really critical to this build. If you don't have this trait, you could probably get by with something like Concealed Repairs, just temporarily, but that's a fixed percentage of your ship's hull. The thing about Plot Armor that's so cool is this amount that it heals scales up depending on a hull restoration skill and that kind of thing. So like, I have Biotech Patch on my list of personal traits. That's 20% extra hull, right? So 69,000 hull. If I unslot that trait, it drops down to 57,000 hull. And that kind of leads into the next one I'm going to talk about, is the Delta Deflector. The Delta Alliance Deflector, not only does it give you 53 hull capacity, so it'll be higher overall hull, but it also gives you the pretty high 42.5 hull restoration. So if I add that in and go back to Plot Armor, you'll see that the heal is higher now, 66,000. If I add back Biotech Patch, we're at 79,000 hull, and my ship has 80,000. So basically, I heal my entire ship's hull in 15 seconds, along with that damage resistance. So it's really easy to buff up plot armor. But a couple of alternatives for deflectors to talk about. The Jem'Hadar deflector has a very high control expertise skill. Let me move this back to the middle. Jem'Hadar deflector has a very high control expertise. On mine, 74.4 at gold. It also adds a little bit of drain, and maybe even more importantly, 31.9 perception, as well as 2.5% stealth detection. And 2.5% stealth detection, all that is 125 perception. I don't know why the tooltips in this game are so cryptic, but that's all it is. So this deflector by itself is like 170 or something, 180 perception, as well as that huge amount of control. So that's a really good deflector to have if you're working on a control build and that's your main focus, control abilities. The Romulan deflector is very similar to the Jem'Hadar deflector. You have a very high amount of control, a little bit more drain, but less perception. You have that stealth detection, the 125, but you're missing that 31.9 perception. But it gives your ship 15 stealth. I don't know if 15 stealth is really worth it, but that's a good alternative, and you can grab that one. The Jem'Hadar deflector is free. You just run the mission and you get it. The Romulan one, you have to buy through the reputation system. The next deflector I'm going to talk about is the Bajoran deflector. This one comes from the Phoenix boxes, and it grants you, if you re-engineer it, it can get you the highest drain expertise available in the game for any singular item. That's 85 drain expertise. So the way that I have mine set up is 85 DRAINX, and then I probably should re-engineer that shield cap modifier. I've been lazy. But if you're doing a Tychon's build or a viral matrix build or anything that scales with drain, this is probably the deflector for you, because 85 DRAINX is a lot. And I'm going to talk about secondary deflectors. And people always ask, why do we use inhibiting deflectors in PvP and not deteriorating deflectors? So inhibiting deflectors, after 4 seconds, it deals a radiation damage hit. In my case, about 10,000 damage. I think it's a little higher once I have all my gear on. And that can crit too, so I could potentially have a bigger hit. The reason why inhibiting deflector is so popular in PvP is it's not cleared by damage over time cleanses. So, for example, I have plot armor on my build, right, which clears all hazard, debuffs, and damage over time effects. If someone hits me with a control effect, and I have the inhibiting deflector thing on me, I will still take that 10,000 damage hit, no matter what. But the deteriorating secondary deflector, which theoretically has a higher damage ceiling, it deals 5,000 damage, but every second for 9 seconds, but it can be cleared. So if my plot armor is up and someone hits me with a drain ability that triggers the deteriorating deflector, I clear that damage instantly. It doesn't even hit me once. It's immediately cleared. And there's so many damage over time cleanses. There's boost morale, there's hazard emitters, there's Science Team clears some of them for some reason. I put a spreadsheet of all this stuff together. It's linked in one of my videos. I'll link it in this video. But basically, the deteriorating deflector, even though on paper it's the better deflector, you will never get actually 9 seconds of radiation damage against your target. You might get 1 or 2 seconds, maybe 3 if you're lucky. And it probably works really, really well against people who aren't PvPers. But anybody that's been PvPing for longer than a month is clearing this immediately. So it's doing nothing for you. So just keep that in mind. That's why inhibiting is the correct one to choose for PvP most of the time. And even on my drain build, I still run the inhibiting deflector because I have tractor beam, and tractor beam will trigger this. I have Tychons on that build, but it doesn't. I parsed it and I looked, and it's very, very poor performer. So, okay, so the next thing, plot armor 15 seconds up, and then you're waiting 30 seconds for it to come back off cooldown, right? So you have to cover that gap somehow. So I have these survivability consoles I'm going to talk about, and let me reorganize a little. The first one I'm going to talk about is the actual temporal distress beacon that comes on the Daemosh. And I'm actually going to, I don't know if I can use it because I'm not in a combat area, but I'll activate it in a second here. But it has a nice passive, extra crit severity, extra shield HP, whatever, doesn't matter. But it drops this duplicate that lasts 30 seconds. And during that 30 seconds, you take no damage whatsoever. So if plot armor is going and you're watching your buff bar and plot armor is close to up, then you hit this, you're immune to damage while you have this big red bubble around you. So also keep in mind, if you're attacking someone and you see this bubble, you might as well stop firing because they're not taking any damage. But this duplicate that I summoned over here, if that dies, I can take damage again. So you'll see me do this a lot in arena videos. I'll be flying and I'll see a Daemosh like this with the red bubble around it. I'll find their pet and I'll target, I'll kill it, and then I'll go back and start shooting them instead. And that's pretty much what you should be doing when you see that duplicate console there. But either way, even though it can be destroyed, it's still really, really effective at keeping you alive. Next one, overloaded Sif linkage. So this one, basically it gives you and your teammates 50% hull regen, and it reduces the damage that they take as well as giving you bonus damage resistance. The drawback is some of the damage dealt to your teammates is also dealt to you. Not very much though, and you resist it, so it's pretty much worth the slot. But the biggest drawback on this console is you can only use it once every 60 seconds. It has a hard lockout. And if you have a teammate that also uses it, if they use it and it touches you, you can't use your copy until that 60 seconds is up. So basically, it only makes sense to have one of these per team at an absolute max because you can use it every minute if you cool it down fast enough. So that's a good console for that. The next one is the Crystalline Absorption Matrix. So this is a Phoenix console, which means it's cheap. It's free basically, so it's easy to get. And it gives you this 500 energy damage resistance rating for 15 seconds. So let me slot that real quick and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. But moving on to the next one, Reactive Anti-Proton Cascade. This one comes from the Tier 5 Obelisk carrier. It gives you 100 resistance, as well as some extra shield resistance, and after 10 seconds reflects damage. I'm not sure I would use this on the Daemosh because it depends on you getting shot for 10 seconds. This is more of a console that would be useful on like a heavy tank or a healer or something that's a lot more survivable. But I have set up a Daemosh healer build, so that's why I'm mentioning it here, because it would go really well on that ship because that one's really durable, and I want people to shoot me on that build. Because if they're shooting me, then they're not shooting my teammates, and it allows them to deal damage without having to worry about getting shot. Interesting thing about Reactive Anti-Proton is it shares a cooldown with the next console, Molecular Phase Inversion. This is another console that's free. You can grab it from the dilithium, like the Tier 4 version of the DRAINX. I talk about this in my free-to-play video, but it gives you 90% shield resistance is a lie. It's 75% because that's what the cap is. But it does give you 300 bonus damage resistance rating and 100,000 defense. I feel like that's got to be a typo or something, but it's pretty funny. Basically, the maximum that you'll be able to be hit when using this console is 25%, because that's the minimum hit chance in the game. So if you use this console, not only you get that bonus resistance, but you also get that huge defense rating, so you won't get damage during this 20 seconds, and it has a really short 1-minute cooldown. The drawback of this console is when you activate it, it starts counting for 20 seconds, and if someone disables you or hits you with evade target lock or subnuke, then you lose the buff immediately. So when I see people use this, what I do is I subnuke them, and then the buff is gone, and they're immediately taking damage again. This console also has some drawbacks on builds that rely on weapon damage. because if you notice there, it takes your weapons offline. So if you're doing something with like torpedoes or technical overload or something like that, you won't be able to have technical overload during that 20 seconds. I use this on my free-to-play a lot. I'll turn it on, and then I turn it off early because you can disable it early when I need to fire my weapons again. So that's an option. Next one is the multi-dimensional wave function. This comes from a Tier 5 Vesta. And it's what I used my Tier 5 coupon this last year on, the one that they gave away for the anniversary event. This console basically reflects kinetic damage back, as well as gives you some immunity to movement debuffs, teleports, kinetic damage, and creates this big purple bubble around you. But basically, if someone flies in and tries to land a bunch of torpedoes on you, you can reflect their damage back with this console. And most of the time, I feel like it doesn't work that well. Most people are smart enough to see it and not shoot you during it. But I have had one or two really gratifying moments where someone lands a bunch of big torpedo hits and immediately dies because of it. It's pretty funny, but it's a bit inconsistent, so keep that in mind. The next one is the Protomatter Field Projector. This came from the Lucari event ship, the Triangle, and basically it's a really large hull and shield regen console. And the more hull regen you have, if you have a higher hull restoration skill, it can regen even higher. And it also regens allies within 3 kilometers, but that's a pretty tight distance, so it's kind of sporadic there. So that's a good console. I have that event ship for free. I'm not sure if I would use a Phoenix token on it unless you have nothing else to buy, but worth mentioning. The next survivability console is DPRM. And a lot of people think of this as an offensive console, but I use it pretty strictly as a defensive console because it's 500% hull regen and 100 bonus damage resistance. So it's just really powerful for staying alive that 20 seconds. And then the next one is a passive. Pax Triburnium. I've mentioned this before in plenty of other videos, but it gives you some hull capacity and some damage resistance that's passive on all the time. And kind of like something I mentioned before about this phase inversion console, right? You have a huge amount of damage resistance, but someone can subnuke you and it's all gone. The Pax Triburnium console, when you're subnuked, you still have this resistance because it's passive. It can't be nuked off of you. So there's something to be said for slotting consoles like this and traits like this as well, because there are times in a PvP match where you'll get subnuked and all of your buffs are gone, and having that extra resistance rating sometimes can be the difference between life and death. So, and I mentioned earlier the crystalline console. These are my resting resistances. Let me activate that and you can see how high they get. 75% pretty much across the board for the crystalline console, and that lasts for 15 seconds. So that's a pretty cool console. I don't think the offensive part of it, the beam damage thing, really does very much, but as a defensive console, it's really good. Okay, the next three also kind of related to survivability, which is why they're here. I have the Alachi Rift Jump and Fluidic Phase Decoupler and Tippler Cylinder, and I forgot it, but also the Picard Maneuver Warp Burst Capacitor. I know I've got it. There it is. So all three of these consoles do some kind of like untargetable teleport escape kind of thing. And the way that holds work in this game, and it's a reason why I recommend everybody try like multiple different builds. If someone uses Parasitic Ice or the big blue Parliament bubble on you or whatever, and you're stuck in it, then if you hit Alachi Rift or Fluidic Phase or Picard Maneuver or Tippler Cylinder, it gets you out of those things. So these are all consoles that are really good on a build like this. They each kind of have their advantages. Like the Picard Maneuver only has a 1 minute cooldown, but you have to have engine power in order to use it. So like the Parliament bubble takes your engines offline, you can't use Warp Burst Capacitor. But Fluidic and Alachi, you don't need engines to use these. You can use these anytime, but they have a 2 minute recharge. so you can't use them as often. And these two consoles are almost exactly the same. The difference is that the Elachi one gives you a little bit of accuracy as a passive and some bonus damage when you phase back in. The Fluidic one, you're a little bit slower and it does like a plasma AoE thing, but the nice thing about Fluidic is you can just buy it from the exchange. These are like 3 million EC, so there's like no excuse not to have one of these because it's so useful on so many builds. The Tippler cylinder, I actually have the tier 5 version of this. I don't have the new T6 one. Tier 5 temporal science ships still show up on the exchange sometimes, so if you can find one cheap, you can grab one that way. But the tier 6 version does have some better passives. I think it's like extra exotic damage or something like that. But either way, the main reason to run this console is for the backstep animation. So when you backstep, not only are you untargetable for 7 seconds, but it also heals you for a few seconds. And it lowers the recharge time of your abilities. So say for example, I need a heal really, really badly and it's on cooldown and I'm getting shot. I can hit this, backstep back, and then that heal is probably going to be off cooldown. I can hit it and stay alive. So it's really useful both as a defensive measure and as kind of a utility console in that respect. And it also cools down captain abilities, so like sensor scan, subnucleonic beam, that kind of thing, which makes this really, really powerful. The next ones, I'm going to talk about ways to boost exotic damage. So this stuff is really basic. You've got the embassy consoles. So I have a hull repair version here with CTRLX on it. So you have this passive control expertise as well as a hull heal when receiving damage. And it is 2.5%, which is low, but there's so many like pets and damage over time effects and spam and just stuff going on that I find that these actually work really well. If you have 3 or 4 of them, like I use these on my healer a lot. A lot of science builds, they'll put a bunch of spam on you when you're in a healer, and these consoles, they just print hull HP like crazy. So that's really good. Another one is the Fleet Research Lab console. The one I have here for an example is a drain ×2, which is 65 total drain, but these come in different variations. So there's EPG control, and there's control shield capacity, and EPG shield capacity, and like a couple of other ones that I forgot. So which version of this console that you want will probably depend on what type of build that you're running. But aside from the good passive, you also have this chance every time you use an exotic ability to get bonus exotic damage. So like if I use Gravity Well, then I get a chance for bonus damage to then more stuff like that. And there's a variant, the one I have here is when using exotic abilities, there's a variant that's based on hull heal. So if you're activating Aux the Sif or Engineering Team over and over and over again in PvP, then the restorative version of this console will also get you that bonus exotic damage. So that's a good one. I also have, a lot of people remember these consoles because they were pretty awful for a while. The Shield Refrequencer console, these come from the Dyson Reputation. And basically you have this 20% chance when using any exotic damage ability, so that's like Tractor Beam, Gravity Well, Tychons, whatever, to deal this proton damage over 5 seconds. But the key word here is over 5 seconds. It's not 13,000 damage for 5 seconds, so total of, 26. I can't do math in my head, but it's only 13,000 total damage. It's not 13,000, then 13,000, then 13,000. Which is a shame that they nerfed them in that way, because I did use these. I slotted like 3 of them or 4 of them for a while, and I was messing around in Karat, and I was parsing, and I looked at the results, and they are awful. But it's worth mentioning anyway here. You get some EPG, you get a chance for a shield heal, and it does cause this proton damage. Ignore shields, so maybe you could make something out of them if you could find a way to boost proton damage more. Again, I'm just putting all the pieces in place for people to experiment with. The next console is the Field Exciter, and I am lucky enough to have an EPG version of this, which grants me a total of 78 exotic particle generator skill, as well as 26% hull capacity. But On a cheaper option, I have another one that is DRAINX, so that's 39 exotic and 39 DRAINX, as well as that shield capacity. You could get a Control X version as well, that would be good. So there's a couple of different options for that. It's mostly a passive console. It's not really doing anything, but it can add a lot of extra damage or skill where you need it. The next three consoles, Deflector, Constriction Anchor, and Aux Ejection Assembly, those are all on here because they have bonus exotic damage just right from the get-go. So Deflector, bonus damage, and crit severity, and the pulse from this also lowers your target's resistance by 20, so that's something worthwhile. Constriction Anchor, it can lock someone down and lower their engine power, but it's so slow that no one ever gets caught in this. I have this on my spam bar and I launch it all the time, and I don't think I've ever seen it actually catch a player who wasn't like AFK or something, so it's mostly there for the bonus exotic damage passive. The Aux Ejection Assembly does have some advantages from a defensive standpoint, and that's the immunity to movement debuffs and the huge speed and turn rate buff that it gives. So if you activate this, you can kind of use it defensively to run away, or you could use it offensively to chase someone down who's running away from you. So that's a good console to have as well. That comes from the Kelvin Timeline Command Cruiser, or if you have the 10th anniversary bundle, the Intel variant of that same Kelvin Constitution ship. The next two for passives, the Fakiri Torment Engine is pretty cool. It has this increased damage over time effects that includes secondary deflectors. If you think you can make something from the deteriorating deflector, this would be a good console to combine with it. It also increases radiation and plasma damage, and fire and physical as well. And it adds this little chance to trigger fire damage, but the damage on that's really low, so it's probably not worth mentioning. And then the next one, the Cutting Tractor Beam. This one, every time you use a universal console, it adds 10% bonus damage to other universal consoles, and it stacks up to 10 times. That could be potentially 100% bonus damage to universal consoles. The thing is, you have to use a universal console every 25 seconds to keep the stacks going. So it's going to depend precisely on what build you have and how many consoles you have. I don't usually run this console because I don't like looking at my buff bar and seeing that this buff is about to run out and feeling obligated to use a universal console at a time that isn't the right opportunity. I try to save my consoles for exactly the right moment where they're going to hit the hardest and be the most effective. If you're just spamming universal consoles, then I don't think it's going to work that well. But on the other hand, I don't have this console, but it's something worth mentioning. If you have the Immolating Phaser Lance, that lance has a pretty good amount of damage, and it's not based on your weapon power. So even though this is a science ship, a Daemosh, you could put this console and the Immolating Phaser Lance on the same build together and just spam the Phaser Lance as often as you can. And that should be enough, theoretically, to get the maximum from this Cutting Beam console. So if I see any Daemoshes next week using the Immolating Lance and Cutting Tractor Beam console, I'm just saying, that was my idea. Okay, so then the next row of consoles, I'm going to talk about control effects. And I'm going to start with the Tholian Web Spinner. This was an event console. It used to be really, really powerful. It did a lot of damage and it held your target for a long time. The damage on this console has been really severely nerfed. So it's not that great for damage anymore. However, that hold effect is still really good. I mentioned that some hold effects, like the Nukara Web Mines, they scale up with control. So right now the base is 10.5 seconds to hold. Let me slot that Jem'Hadar deflector real quick with all that control, and now it's 11.6 seconds. So it's not that huge of a difference, but if you have a lot of control stacked up, you could hold someone for 10, 15, maybe even more amount of time. However, it is instantly cleared by engineering team. So if someone holds you with this, just hit engineering team and you can get out of it. And the same thing for hostile acquisition. So hostile acquisition is also a hold effect for 5 seconds, but if you hit engineering team, you instantly get out of this. But I put it on here anyway because it's a good console both for escorts and for science builds. But not only do you have accuracy, it gives you 30 control and a hold, and it lowers their flight speed and damage, as well as debuffs their resistance. So it's just a really good console to have. The next one, kind of a weird one, opening salvo from the Titan. It's hard to precisely land this on a target. But if you hold someone, like say you hold someone with web spinner or hostile acquisition, and they're in front of you, and you hit opening salvo, when the opening salvo torpedoes hit, they knock all subsystems offline. That includes shields, auxiliary, weapons, everything is gone. And the duration that this subsystem offline is, it's based on your DRAINX skill. So I have a lot of drain on the build right now, and this subsystem offline is 14 seconds. So that is resisted by your target, and I'm going to do a little talk about that when I get to the end here. But if you're holding someone and you knock all their systems offline, that could be pretty effective. So that's worth mentioning. The next one is the Tachyon net drones. This one came out relatively recently on the Bozeman frigate. It gives you a little bit of perception as well as crit and severity, and it deploys this net thing that it disables cloak, intel team, lowers the target's damage resistance, and if you crit them during that time, which happens all the time, it knocks their shields offline for a few seconds. And the duration of the shield offline effect is really finicky. I can't seem to figure out exactly why sometimes people are immune to having their shields knocked off by it for like a few seconds, but then they're knocked off later. I don't understand why. But if you've got someone locked down and they're held in place and you put this on them, all of a sudden their shields are gone. Obviously, right now with a lot of broken things like trauma response and stuff, this isn't as effective since people are piercing through shields anyway, but in the traditional meta of the game, or whenever trauma response gets fixed or nerfed or whatever, this will probably be really good again. Next one, Chains of Fire. This came from a Fakiri destroyer or something, some event ship I forgot about. And it basically does a pull effect. It's like tractor beam repulsors in a console. And speaking of that, I don't have this console, but multi-target tractor arrays, especially if you're Federation aligned, it's really cheap. Go grab one. But multi-target tractor arrays, when you click it, and same thing with Chains of Fire here, it just grabs random enemies around you and pulls them close to you. Sometimes it might grab NPCs, which you don't really care about, and that sucks. But if you get a player with this, it does kind of slow them down, hold them, and it deals a little bit of fire damage, which doesn't seem to be resisted very much, but it's not enough damage to kill anyone on their own, so you'd have to combine this with like other things. Next one, Enhanced Tractor Drones. I love this console because when you put Enhanced Tractor Drones on someone, they can't use Intel Team. So it's a good way to combat Exodus users, has been for a long time. It also slows them down. And that little pulls target towards you thing, it's kind of wonky the way it works, but it does, basically it stops them for a second and then they keep flying, and then it stops them for a second and then they keep flying. So it's a little jerky the way it works, but it can mess someone up basically, to slow them down for you to then apply additional control effects. Sticky Web. This console makes me laugh just every time I use it. But it puts a big square out and it puts it directly behind a target. So if someone is running away from you and they're not quite fast enough, if you deploy this console on them, it will immediately appear in front of them. They slam right into it and it disables their cloak, it disables Intel Team, and it also makes them slower and reduces their turn rate. So they kind of get stuck on it for a few seconds, which is a great opportunity either to then deal more damage or let your team catch up to the target if you're all chasing the same target. The next one, I experimented with this a little while ago and I thought it was going to suck, but it wasn't as bad as I expected. The Energy Nullifier comes from the Herc Vedcrid Dreadnought. I know people that use that ship for healer a lot, and this console, it creates these nullifiers. They kind of spread all out. It's like a mine, actually, but it shoots 32 of them out in a big web all around you. And if they collide with your target, it's negative 50 energy power, and if 2 of them collide with the target, it does stack, so it's negative 100 engine power. So if you catch somebody in the right kind of web of these, you could knock their engines offline for a few seconds, but they don't deal a lot of damage, and they only last 15 seconds. I think that's the biggest drawback of them. With mines sit around forever. So they'll sit around until somebody hits them. With this one, if you deploy the web and then they just fly away from you, then it was a wasted slot. So kind of situational. Next one, Approaching Agony. And the reason I put this one in the control console list is because of this 2-target 25% chance to disable. And that 25% chance is every half second. So this last 30 or 40 seconds or 50 seconds, it's kind of hard to tell there. But basically, this is a console version of Ionic Turbulence. They gave this console away for free with a bunch of codes last year, so almost everybody has one at this point. And that disable, it does lock out trays, and it breaks things like evasive maneuvers, or like the cooldown for molecular phase where it's counting and all that stuff. So this is a really good console to have to kind of mess people's trays up if they're already in a hold. And yes, it deals phaser damage, but that's not really the highlight of the console. It's about the hold, or the disable rather. The next one is the Soliton Wave Generator. This came from that Rycian luxury cruiser event ship. But basically what this one does is it pulls targets close to you within a certain distance, and it lowers their engine power settings for 15 seconds, and it boosts your engine power. And if someone is near you when it expires, it also knocks their engine system offline for a little while. So it's a pretty good console in that it sort of sucks them closer and disables engines. Kind of the same function there is that you're trying to slow someone down to stop them. And probably the ultimate two when it comes to slowing someone down and stopping them, the Parliament console. This creates those big blue bubbles that people see. Controlled gravimetric demolition. It creates a big blue bubble field for 30 seconds and disables the engines of anything in it. The drawback of this console is it's just like a big static bubble. So as soon as someone uses anything untargetable, like evade target lock, or Elachi Rift, or fluidic phase, or temporal backstep, or whatever, then they're immune to it, basically. So this bubble is really powerful because it locks them in one spot and disables their engines, but they can get out of it pretty easily. I think the idea really, and the way that I try to use this console, is I try to sort of trick my target into using, like if I see someone use Elachi Rift and it's on cooldown for them, that's when I want to use this console. Because I want to get them trapped so that they're stuck there for a long time. Because I think we all know, I've been on the receiving end of this, and so have plenty of other people. All your stuff is on cooldown, and then someone deploys this on you, and you're stuck, and you're like watching the cooldown of something on your bar, and you're like, oh no, I'm so screwed, because you can't get out of it, you know? So that's a really, really good console, but it's super situational when you use it. And same thing with the next one, Parasitic Ice. So Parasitic Ice, it kind of does the same thing. It locks onto your target, it holds them in place, and it disables their engine, and it lasts up to 20 seconds. So you could lock someone in place for a really, really long time with Parasitic Ice. The main problem with Parasitic Ice, and this is also a problem with the Parliament console here, if they're moving really fast, the ice will not hit. Like, the visual applies and the ice deploys, but I think the way that these two consoles work is there's like a half-second delay before it actually kind of spawns into the game, and it could be worse if the game is laggy or if your target is laggy. So if your target is moving really fast, the game thinks that they're out of range by the time this console deploys. Like, I've used Parasitic Ice, seen it hit someone, do nothing, and they just fly off. But when it works, it is really good, which is why I still use it on a lot of my builds. But again, that kind of plays into what I was talking about before, right? You use like Hostile or Web Spinner or tractor drones or something to slow the target down. Maybe you sub-nuke them to slow them down, and then you use Ice or Parliament Bubble or whatever to get them locked down. And then you use Opening Salvo to keep them there as long as you can. And the way that you do it is going to depend a lot on your build. Like, if you're using Tychons, you probably want to hold Tychons until they're already trapped. and then put Tychons on them, and then they're really in trouble. So you'll kind of want to come up with your own, I guess, like sequence or method of using those consoles. And then that kind of leads to the next section, and that is damage consoles. So the neutronic eddy generator deals a pretty good amount of radiation damage and really, really knocks off their shields. One other good thing about this console is when you deploy it, it kind of creates a big flashy purple light show around you and can make it hard to see you, and you can use it to kind of reposition, like if you use temporal surge or something right before this and then run away, you know, whoever's chasing you might lose you. So it's got a defensive side to it as well, but it does deal a pretty good amount of radiation damage. The next two, micro dark matter anomaly and plasma storm. Both of these deal a huge amount of damage. Micro dark matter technically deals more damage, but it's kinetic damage, and the biggest drawback of this one is it flies around. So it kind of floats around towards whatever it thinks is like a good target. So if you aim at a player and you have a player targeted and you activate this, it will fly directly to them, and then it kind of like gets bored and flies off, and it's like attacking some like random pet or something, and then the player's sitting there, you know, unharmed, and that's the problem. But when it works, it does deal a lot of damage. Plasma Storm, on the other hand, does a lot of damage, and it sits in one place. So if you put Plasma Storm on someone and they're stuck in ice or Parliament or Web Spinner or whatever, then they're going to take all this damage because it literally just sits right on top of them, drilling into them every half second, 2,800 plasma damage or more. And it also lowers their flight speed, and there's this little pull that it does as well, so it helps keep them in the Plasma Storm. So that's a really good one. And then the next three I'm going to mention, and I forgot to include it on here, but Isometric Charge goes in this list as well, but Akar's Vengeance, electrical damage, Cascading Subatomic, electrical damage, Cascading Gravimetric, kinetic damage. All three of these consoles are like a one-shot, huge amount of damage. So if you're leaning less towards the control side of things and more towards spike damage, then these are good options to have. Like say, for example, instead of Plasma Storm, if you lock someone down in Parasitic Ice and then immediately hit them with all three of these back to back, you could probably knock them from full to zero pretty quickly. Maybe combine it with Technical Overload or a high-yield Delphic Torpedo, and then all that stuff together on your science build. And you could basically line someone up and then hit them with a bunch of spike damage. And yeah, they're on cooldown after that for a while. That's kind of the trade-off. But I think there's something there. I made a Vapor, like a Psi Vapor thing one time, where it was the three of these consoles, Isometric Charge, Technical Overload, and I think I used like the EBM Torp on a Tactical Captain. And there were a lot of times where I was flying around like waiting for the consoles to come off cooldown because I couldn't do anything. But I had a few really awesome moments where I just nailed somebody from full to zero in like one shot. And, you know, so those consoles are good for that. As an additional effect, Akar's disables their subsystems, basically like Viral Matrix in a console. The length of the subsystem disable is increased by your drain skill. Cascading Subatomic has a debuff effect, so when you hit the primary target, whoever you're shooting, it also lowers their resistances by -10. And then the next one, Gravimetric, this one doesn't have any crazy debuffs or anything, and it's kinetic damage. So it's probably not as good as the other two, but maybe combining all three together, like start with Cascading Subatomic, it will knock their shields down and debuff them. Then Akar's, which does electrical damage that ignores shields, and then Cascading Gravimetric, their shield facing is already down, so you hit them with the kinetic damage, something like that. I'm just spitballing here at this point. Okay, so that's the gist of it. It's a lot of Universal Console stuff. And of course, a critical trait to that Universal Console stuff is unconventional systems. Sorry, that's intelligence. Boop, boop. This one. Unconventional systems. Every time you use a control ability, it recharges Universal Consoles. And I really want you to keep that fresh in your mind when we go to the Bridge Officer section. So I'm going to go straight to Bridge Officers now so you don't forget. So we're recharging control abilities. So something that has a 2-minute recharge can be reduced drastically. So let's look at those different layouts. So this is the first layout that I want to talk about. It's a build based around Gravity Well for spam and technical overload. So I've got Gravity Well and I've got Surgical Strikes 1, but it's not actually for the damage. It's just to trigger technical overload. You could also do beam overload instead here. But either way works. For engineering, I never want to go without emergency to engines. It's pretty much required to me. Engineering team is also required because it clears like subsystem disables and that kind of thing. And then I have Oxysif for the placate. So this is kind of the minimum amount of engineering that I would want to run. And remember I said that this ship was really flexible, and you'll see as I go through the other layouts. So this one has, I've got my engineering team, I've got science team, I've got my speed, my placate, I have intel team, and then I have a bunch of control effects. I have gravity well, tractor repulsors, photonic shock waves, scramble sensors, jam sensors, ionic turbulence. So this build is able to cool down universal consoles very rapidly. So if I'm using Plasma Storm, and that's a huge part of my build, just as an example, I can cool down the 2-minute of Plasma Storm, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, 7%. And basically, instead of having Plasma Storm every 2 minutes, I Plasma Storm every 1 minute. And that applies to the, that also applies to these consoles that help keep me alive. So like DPRM, I can use more often. I don't have to wait 2 minutes to use DPRM again. So if that's part of my kind of survivability rotation on this build, and now you see why it's so hard for me to give out just one specific build, just to say, hey, use this, but there's not an easy way to do it because there's so many options. Like the next one, also Gravity Well Spammer, right? Very similar, except this one has Very Cold in Space. And instead of Ox's Sif Placate, I have Emergency Power to Ox, which might let me use something like, there are these duty officers. Where's one? When you use Emergency Powered Auxiliary, it increases your shield and hull repair skill. So you can put 3 of these on, and your plot armor and your heals and stuff, they heal you a huge amount. So this, even though you don't have the placate, you have this huge amount of healing. And also a lot of unconventional systems. You got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on this one. So you could get some kind of rotation with, you got your big engineering team heal. Maybe instead of Very Cold, maybe you would run hazard emitters. So you've got plot armor for 15 seconds, then hazard emitters for 15 seconds, and then to cover the gap, some universal console, you know, and you have all these cooldowns for it. And the whole time you're throwing out gravity wells and plasma storms and all that stuff. So that's a nice like alternative build there. And no intel team on this one as well. It's just raw survivability. Next one, this is a Tychon's build that I have been running for a little bit. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes I feel like it doesn't, but you'll notice it's really similar to my Gravwell Spammer. The biggest difference is I have Tychon's Rift, Viral Matrix, Very Cold in Space 1, and Ionic Turbulence. And the reason for that is a lot of people forget this, it seems, but spore-infused anomalies is a pretty important part of any science build, right? It also has a drain effect. In my case right now, -42, all power levels for 20 seconds, as well as the electrical damage. Everyone remembers the electrical damage, but there's a drain here too. So if I have Tychon's, Ionic Turbulence, and Very Cold in Space, and all 3 of those do a spore-infused anomaly shot, that's negative 120 some power levels. So, I mean, that's a huge drain effect. Viral Matrix also scales with drain. I think on that build, I actually have that build set up, I think. Yes. So like the duty officers for that build, I have the systems engineer, a 25% chance to disable additional subsystems after a delay. And for a really long time, I mean, where's my Viral Matrix? Disable subsystems for 15.8 seconds. This one, disable subsystems for 18.9 seconds. And it is resisted by your target, but you could knock their subsystems off for a really long time. And then I have tractor repulsors, photonic shockwave, and ionic turbulence. So there's 3 unconventional systems procs. So this one, it's a little bit more fragile because I don't have the ability to use my universal consoles as often, both for damage or for staying alive. So that's kind of a drawback to having so much drain potential. Next one is a snooper build designed to combat Exodus. So this one, I've got, you'll see I rotated the seats around a little bit. So the pilot seat has both pilot team and attack pattern lambda. And this universal seat that was previously a science seat is now engineering. So I have emergency power to aux 3, lambda 2, and intel team 3 all in the same build. And it's a science ship. So this has enough perception to target anybody through Exodus, full 10-kilometer range. So it basically crushes Exodus. However, in trade for that, I only have 2 unconventional systems procs, Gravity Well and Ionic Turbulence. And I delayed Overload Cascade, so maybe instead of that I could do Photonic Shockwave. So there's 3. And then I put the Ensign Universal as engineering team because I feel like I have to have that. So it's a little more, less universal consoles, but you have that huge amount of perception. Or, I'm just thinking about it right now. How about move engineering team there, put tractor beam there, and then viral matrix. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's probably better. I've got 5 unconventional systems procs, and I still have Intel Team 3, Lambda, and emergency to aux, as well as tractor beam now, because tractor beam also disables Intel teams. So not only can you see someone, but you could tractor them and make them an easy target. I don't think this would be the best build solo, but if you were paired with someone else, like a dogfighter, you could fly up to an Exodus ship, put tractor beam on them, and then your dogfighter can score the kill. Something like that. All right, next one. Torpedo high yield build. So this one, I've got a lot of speed using this seat here, and I have Lambda for accuracy, as well as perception, and pilot team to clear placates. And the Intel seat, instead of using a lot of Intel, I still have Intel team, but I have attack pattern Omega and high yield 2. And the reason why I use these 2 together is, for example, there's a trait, Assault Formation Theta. When you use attack pattern Omega or decloak, it gives you a high yield 3. So you could decloak, use Omega, and then use high yield 2 here, and you have 2 high yield 3s and a high yield 2 back to back with pretty good accuracy and damage. And then my other skills, I put Photonic Shockwave on here. The reason for that, not only is it unconventional systems proc, but it lowers your target's kinetic resistance if you're actually close enough to hit them with it. So I have Tractor Beam, I have Delayed Overload Cascade, which is big kinetic damage. So basically this is a build about dealing a whole bunch of kinetic damage. And I think this could be a pretty good build to kind of fly in and land a bunch of big torpedoes or something like that. Next build, this is a really, really speedy build. So I've got, instead of Lambda this time, I have Clean Getaway, Emergency to Engines 3, and Omega. They're all speed boosts. And then I still have Intel Team and Evade Target Lock kind of for my own survivability, Oxysif Placate, Engineering Team. And then the Science Seat, because of the speed, I'm using Viral Matrix kind of in an attempt to slow down my target. Tractor repulsors and jam sensors are mostly just there for unconventional systems procs, because Clean Getaway is also an unconventional systems proc now as well. And Photonic Officer, I just use the 2 variant to try to maximize that cooldown. And Science Team, of course, can't live without that. So this one would be lots of speed, but maybe not a lot of damage. So how you want to use this might depend on what universal consoles or what weapons you have. This one might be good with, say, that example I gave with cascading subatomic and Akars and all that. And then the very last one I want to go over is actually the build that I use as a healer on this one is I have emergency power to aux and engines, and emergency power to aux is there for the maintenance duty officers that increase your healing, right? Then I have Oxysif Engineering Team 3 to give out to my friends, And then I have tactical team and science team combined with engineering team, and that's for team synergy. That's the trait where if you use tactical team, science team, or engineering team on yourself or any ally, everyone on your team also gets a little copy of it. So you're able to clear debuffs off of your teammates with this really well. I have Intel Team, which is both for myself, but you can also cast Intel Team on your teammates. So that's worth noting. And Evade Target Lock is there mostly for my own survivability. And then I have Hazard Emitters 3, which is a nice big heal to a teammate. And then 2 Unconventional Systems procs, Tractor Beam and Gravity Well. That's mostly just to kind of help out with sort of crowd control, but this build isn't really about dealing a lot of damage. This is about healing your teammates and keeping them alive, less than it is raw damage. But it's still good to throw a Gravity Well or Tractor Beam and Exodus user, so that's why they're on here. And it would help me use Universal Consoles more often, like say for example, since I'm a healer, I might use the Lucari Protomatter console, or I might use Reiterative Structural Capacitor, like that one. You can cast that on a teammate and it heals them, so you could use that more often, that kind of thing. And I'll run through the traits one last time, but like I feel like some of these are kind of build dependent. So I think the core to this build is Plot Armor, Zal, and Spore-Infused Anomalies. Those are pretty much a must-have on any variant of this build. But the next 3, you could slot whatever you like. If you're doing the healer version, right, you could do like Radiant Nanite Cloud or Unified Engineering, something like that. And Team Synergy, that was the one I just mentioned, this one, to kind of help out your teammates. If you're a Gravity Well build, then you might want to do Improved Gravity Well. Where is that? Improved Gravity Well. That makes your Gravity Wells last 40 seconds and lowers their cooldown. So Aftershock Gravity Wells, by the way, also benefit from this trait. So if you have Aftershock Gravity Wells, they also last 40 seconds with this. Also for a healer, or even the Gravity Well build, you might use Improved Photonic Officer, bonus to shield and hull healing, as well as exotic damage. Invasive Maneuvers is a good one for survivability, keeping yourself alive. I mean, there's just so many options. Like if you're running Tychons, for example, or Viral Matrix, then you're not going to run Improved Gravity Well. But you might run, I don't have it on this character, but like the Voth Bastille has a trait that gives you 50 DRAINX. The Norway has a trait that lowers your target's drain skill. Yeah, I mean, Carrier Wave Shield Hacking, if you're using Tractor Beam, this will take their shield offline. And I guess this is kind of as good a place as any for this last footnote that I wanted to talk about, because these 2 traits are right next to each other. Carrier Wave Shield Hacking, Catastrophic Overload, and there's other things like this, like the Agony Phaser Torpedo. All right, so let's talk about skills, I guess, to lead into that. You have Control Expertise and Drain Expertise. Those are like the main 2 things. Control resist control effects like disables, holds, repel and pull, that's like a Tractor Beam, confuse, placate, and debuffs to flight speed and turn rate. So a lot of people run really high control. You also should run really high control if you're running a Gravity Well build, that kind of thing. The amount of control skill that you have not only increases the control ability effectiveness, but it also resists control effects. So in theory, everything should benefit from Control X, and same thing for Drain X, but that's for power drains and that kind of thing. But that's not actually the case in reality. So, for example, Carrier Wave Shield Hacking is a shield offline effect for 5 seconds. If you have 1,000 drain or 1,000 control, it doesn't matter, it's always 5 seconds. However, so this doesn't scale up with your skill level. However, it does scale to your target's resistances. So, if you're attacking someone and they have 100 DRAINX, the shield disable from this will only last 2 seconds, or 2.5 seconds. It's cut in half. And there's no way to increase this. If you attack someone, I tested this earlier, if you have like 500 CTRLX and you put carrier wave on them, it's cleared almost instantly. It's like a quarter of a second. It's amazing how fast it gets cleared. And there's no way to increase this. And like same thing with catastrophic overload. This has a disable for 3 seconds, right? If I have a million CTRLX, the disable is still 3 seconds. And they resist it. So they're not actually disabled for 3 seconds. They're only disabled for 1 second or 2 seconds. So there's stuff like that. I think it's funny because it says right on it, skills that affect this ability, EPG control, but it's not actually increased by control. So this one lies to you on the tooltip. And there's lots of stuff like this, really. But there's other traits like opening salvo. I talked about that one earlier, right? Increases the duration of subsystem offline. If you have higher DRAINX, it increases that skill. So like, let me take off a couple drain consoles. It was 14.8 seconds. Now it's 11.5 seconds. So you can scale that one up to try to counteract someone resisting it. But not everything works that way. And which ones work which way is always a subject to debate. We've had things where it wasn't resisted and then a patch comes out and there's nothing about it in the notes and all of a sudden it's resisted. I mean, it's impossible. So I think the best advice that I can give is to find yourself a friend or send me a message on Discord. I talk about this stuff. Or, get with your fleet mates or whatever and test this stuff. The way that I test a lot of it is since I have that second account, that free-to-play account, I go into a 1v1 with myself and I park my 2 ships across from each other and I test stuff. Like I test tractor repulsors to see if it actually pulls my ship and how much at different control skill levels and all that stuff. And I know it's boring, but there's a reason why the build is such a critical part of this kind of thing. So anyway, I think that's all I have. I might have created more questions than I gave answers here, but I'd really encourage you to kind of work on your own build, work on your own style, come up with something that works. Obviously, there's some staples. I think the very first, this is my drain build. I have hazard emitters on here because I was worried about it dying, but you could swap that out for something else. But I think like this is kind of a good starting point to start from. But I wouldn't recommend Tychons to start. I'd probably say Gravity Well just from the get-go, and then with the Gravity Well Aftershock DOF. This is the Tychons Aftershock DOF, but same concept. And then just do something like this and kind of work with it, try different things, and I'm sure you'll find something that works. And whatever universal consoles or torpedoes and things you have, you can find something. And a lot of it also is going to depend on who you're playing against. That's another thing that's kind of seldom talked about in PvP, but I could have a build that is completely perfect and just absolutely wrecks against 2 or 3 players that I know personally that we practice together. But then if I take it out and I'm playing against somebody that I don't know and I don't know what they're using and what they're going to do, it might not work against them. So that's another kind of key thing to remember about any kind of building in this game is a lot of this stuff is really, really situational. This isn't PvE. In PvE, it's the same targets, the same enemies, the same health, everything over and over again. But in PvP, it's always different depending on who you're fighting. And like the build that I'm running right now, I might end this video and change it tomorrow because I'm always innovating stuff. So you don't necessarily know what I'm going to be running. So if you used a build against me that didn't work yesterday, it might work tomorrow. Because maybe I decide I don't need hazard emitters anymore and I remove this for something else. And then you deal more damage over time effects and all of a sudden I'm like, crap, I wish I had hazard emitters or something. So anyway, thanks for listening to me ramble. I'm sure this video is going to be like an hour long. Forgive me for that. And have a good one.